The fluorescent lights of Rosie's diner buzzed overhead like dying wasps as I wiped down the same sticky table for the third time tonight, my feet screaming in protest against the worn-out sneakers that had seen better days about 2 years and 100 double shifts ago. I could feel the exhaustion settling into my bones like an old friend, the kind of tiredness that comes from working 16-hour days just to keep the electricity on and the rent paid, the kind of weariness that makes you wonder if there's anything more to life than coffee stains and demanding customers who tip in loose change. The diner smelled like grease and broken dreams, a combination of burnt coffee, day-old meatloaf, and the desperation that seemed to cling to every surface in this part of town where people came to hide from their problems or drown them in cheap whiskey and cheaper company. I glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m., which meant I had another hour and 13 minutes before I could drag myself home to the apartment I shared with my father. Though lately it felt more like I lived there alone considering he was never around, always at some card game or casino or wherever men went when they were running from their responsibilities and the disappointed eyes of their daughters. My mother would have been heartbroken to see what he'd become in the 3 years since she'd passed, how he'd traded her memory for poker chips and the false promise of one big win that would solve all our problems. But I couldn't think about that now, because thinking about her meant feeling things I couldn't afford to feel when I was barely holding myself together with coffee and sheer stubborn will. The bell above the door chimed, that cheerful little jingle that seemed absurdly optimistic for the kind of clientele we usually attracted at this hour. And I looked up expecting to see another drunk looking for coffee to sober up or a trucker needing directions to the interstate. Instead, I saw 3 men in suits that probably cost more than I made in 6 months walk through that door like they owned not just the diner, but the entire world. And suddenly the air felt different, heavier, like the atmosphere before a tornado touches down and rips everything apart. These weren't the kind of men who came to Rosie's diner, not with their tailored Italian suits and their cold, calculating eyes that swept across the room, cataloging every exit and every person with the kind of precision that made my survival instinct scream that something was very, very wrong. The few customers we had, old Joe at the counter, the couple in booth 3 who were definitely having an affair, the college kid cramming for exams in the corner, all seemed to sense it too, because conversation died like someone had flipped a switch, and the only sound was the sizzle of the grill in the back, and my own heartbeat thundering in my ears like a drum announcing an execution. The men moved with a predatory grace that made me think of sharks circling prey, their shoes clicking against the worn linoleum floor in perfect synchronization. And I realized with a sinking feeling in my stomach that they weren't here for coffee or pie or anything as innocent as late-night food. "We're looking for Isabel Romano," the tallest one said, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey and just as likely to burn going down. And I felt my blood turn to ice in my veins because nobody called me by my full name, except bill collectors and people from my father's past that I'd spent my whole life trying to avoid. "There's no one here by that name," I lied, gripping the dirty rag in my hand like it could somehow protect me from whatever was about to happen, my voice coming out steadier than I felt even as my knees threatened to give out beneath me. "You must have the wrong place, wrong person, wrong everything, so maybe you should try somewhere else because I've got customers to serve and tables to clean and absolutely no interest in whatever you're selling." The man smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made me understand why prey animals froze when predators showed their teeth, all white and perfect and completely devoid of any warmth or humanity. "We know you're Isabel Romano, we know your father is Thomas Romano, and we know he's been very difficult to locate lately, which is unfortunate for him, and now, apparently, unfortunate for you as well," he said, pulling out his phone and showing me a picture of my father that looked like it had been taken just hours ago, his face pale and terrified in a way that made my stomach drop to somewhere around my worn-out shoes. "I don't know where he is," I said, which was the truth even if it sounded like a lie, because my father had stopped telling me where he went weeks ago, stopped looking me in the eye when he stumbled in at dawn, smelling like cigars and desperation, stopped being the man who used to braid my hair and call me his little princess back when Mom was alive and our family wasn't held together by my minimum wage job and his broken promises. That's disappointing, but not entirely unexpected, another one of the men said. This one shorter, but somehow more dangerous, with eyes that reminded me of a snake I'd seen once at the zoo, flat and cold, and completely unconcerned with anything resembling human empathy. However, you're going to come with us anyway, because our employer would very much like to discuss your father's outstanding debts. And since your father isn't available, you're the next best thing, the collateral he left behind when he decided to make himself scarce. The word collateral hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs and making my vision blur at the edges, because I'd heard that word before in the context of my father's gambling, whispered conversations he didn't think I could hear about markers and debts and people who didn't take kindly to being stiffed. I'm not going anywhere with you, I said, backing, up until my hip hit the counter, my hand instinctively reaching for the phone in my apron pocket, even though I had no idea who I would call or what I would say that could possibly make this situation any better. Miss Romano, we can do this the easy way or the difficult way, and I promise you that you don't want to find out what the difficult way entails, the tall one said, his hand moving to his jacket in a gesture that suggested he had something there that would make arguing a very bad idea. Our employer is waiting, and he's not a patient man, particularly when it comes to people who owe him money and the family members who might convince those people to pay what's owed. My mind raced through possibilities like a trapped animal looking for escape. I could scream, but who would help me? Old Joe, who was 70 and had a bad hip. The college kid who looked like he might pass out from fear. The affair couple who were already gathering their things to leave because they wanted nothing to do with whatever this was. I could run, but where would I go and how far would I get in shoes that were falling apart and against men who looked like they could run down prey for sport? I could fight, but I was a 24-year-old waitress who'd never thrown a punch in her life against 3 men who clearly made violence their profession. Please, I whispered, hating how my voice cracked, hating the tears that burned behind my eyes, hating my father for putting me in this position, and hating myself for caring enough about him that I couldn't just walk away and let him face whatever consequences he'd earned. Please, I don't have anything to do with his debts. I've been working 2 jobs just to keep us afloat while he gambles away everything we have. I don't even talk to him most days. I can't help you find him or make him pay or whatever it is you think I can do. You're right. You can't help us with any of those things, the tall man agreed, his voice almost gentle, which somehow made everything worse because kindness from a monster is just another kind of cruelty. But you can come with us right now, quietly and without making a scene that would upset these good people trying to enjoy their late-night coffee and pie, and you can have a conversation with our employer about how your father's debts might be settled in ways that don't involve anyone getting hurt, at least not tonight. Not if you're smart about this. I looked around the diner one last time at the life I'd built from scraps and determination, at Rosie behind the counter watching with wide, frightened eyes, but not intervening. Because what could a 60-year-old woman with arthritis do against men like these? At the customers who wouldn't meet my gaze because they were already pretending they hadn't seen anything worth remembering. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. That same annoying sound that had been the soundtrack to my life for the past 2 years. And I realized with a clarity that felt like drowning that nothing was ever going to be the same after I walked out that door. That whatever waited for me outside was going to change everything in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. Let me get my coat, I said quietly, untying my apron with trembling fingers that didn't want to cooperate. And the tall man nodded like I'd made the only sensible choice. Which maybe I had. Or maybe I'd just sealed my fate in a way that would haunt me for whatever remained of my life after tonight. They escorted me outside into the November cold that bit through my thin jacket and made my breath come out in clouds that dissipated into the darkness. And there in the parking lot sat 3 black SUVs with tinted windows that looked like something from a movie about organized crime and government conspiracies. But it was the 4th vehicle that made my heart stop completely. A black Rolls-Royce that gleamed under the streetlights like a polished weapon. So out of place in this rundown neighborhood that it might as well have been a spaceship that had landed in the middle of nowhere. The tall man walked to the Rolls-Royce and opened the back door, and I could see someone sitting in the shadows. A figure that radiated power and danger even though I couldn't make out any features yet. "Miss Romano is here, sir," he said, with a deference that suggested whoever was in that car was someone even these dangerous men feared and respected. "Bring her here," a voice said from inside the car, deep and rough like gravel and velvet mixed together, with an accent that suggested Italian heritage and expensive education, the kind of voice that made you want to obey even as every instinct screamed to run. "I want to see the woman whose father thought he could steal from me and disappear without consequences. The daughter he left behind like she was worth less than the debts he accumulated at my tables." The tall man's hand settled on my lower back, not quite pushing but definitely guiding, and I found myself walking toward that open door like I was approaching the gates of hell, my legs moving of their own accord while my brain screamed at me to fight, to run, to do anything except step closer to whatever monster waited in that car. I reached the door and looked inside, and that's when I saw him for the first time, the man who would destroy my life and remake it into something I couldn't recognize. The devil in a three-piece suit who looked at me like I was already his property. Dante Salvatore sat in the back of that Rolls-Royce like a king on a throne, all dark eyes and sharp cheekbones, and a presence that sucked the air from my lungs and made me forget how to breathe. He was beautiful in the way that poisonous things are beautiful, dangerous and compelling and absolutely lethal, with black hair that fell across his forehead and a scar that ran down his left jaw like someone had tried to kill him once and failed. A failure they probably didn't live to regret. He wore a black suit that fit him like it had been created specifically for his body, which it probably had, and his hands, God. His hands were elegant and brutal at the same time, with scarred knuckles that suggested he didn't just order violence but participated in it personally. But it was his eyes that held me frozen, dark as midnight and twice as dangerous, eyes that seemed to see through every defense I'd ever built and catalog every secret I'd ever kept, eyes that promised things I didn't have names for, but knew instinctively would change me in fundamental ways. He looked at me for what felt like an eternity, his gaze traveling from my face down to my scuffed shoes and back up again, and I felt stripped bare under that assessment, like he could see not just my body but my soul, and found both wanting and fascinating in equal measure. "Isabel Romano," he said, my name rolling off his tongue like a prayer or a curse, I couldn't tell which. "Your father owes me $3 million from gambling debts accumulated over the past 6 months at my casino. Money he borrowed against markers he had no ability to repay. Money he spent chasing losses he'll never recover because men like your father always believe the next hand will be the one that saves them. $3 million. The number hit me like a tsunami, washing away any hope I'd had that this was some kind of mistake or misunderstanding, because my father couldn't have gambled away $3 million. We didn't have $3 million. We barely had $3,000. And the scope of his betrayal and stupidity made me physically ill. "That's impossible," I whispered, even though I knew it wasn't. Knew that addiction didn't care about possibility or reality, or the daughter left behind to pick up the pieces. "We don't have that kind of money. We've never had that kind of money. There's no way he could have borrowed it from me with the promise of collateral that turned out to be non-existent. Lies built on more lies. A house of cards that collapsed the moment I decided to call in his debts." Dante finished, his voice calm and almost conversational, like we were discussing the weather instead of my father's death warrant. "He's been avoiding my calls, my men, my increasingly urgent requests for payment, which is unfortunate because I'm not a man who accepts being ignored, and I'm certainly not a man who forgives debts of this magnitude." "I'll pay it back," I heard myself say, the words tumbling out before I could stop them, desperate and pathetic and completely unrealistic because even if I worked every day for the rest of my life, I'd never make $3 million. But I had to try, had to offer something, because the alternative was watching my father die. And I wasn't ready for that. Wasn't ready to be completely alone in this world. "I'll work," I'll get another job. I'll do whatever it takes. Just please don't hurt him. Please give us time to make this right." Dante smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen, beautiful and cruel and utterly without mercy. "You couldn't pay back $3 million if you lived 3 lifetimes working at that diner, sweet Isabel. And I'm not interested in installment plans or promises or any of the usual negotiations people attempt when they realize they're in debt to the Salvatore family," he said, leaning forward slightly. And I caught his scent, expensive cologne and something darker, like gunpowder and danger made into a fragrance. "However, I am a businessman, and I believe in making deals that benefit both parties, so I'm going to give you 2 choices, and you have 24 hours to decide which one you prefer." My mouth went dry, and I couldn't look away from those dark eyes that held me captive more effectively than any chains or locks. "What choices?" I managed to ask, though part of me didn't want to know. Didn't want to hear what a man like Dante Salvatore considered a fair deal when my father's life hung in the balance. "Choice 1. I kill your father tonight, quickly and efficiently, and you go back to your life at the diner and forget you ever met me, forget this conversation ever happened. Move on, and maybe someday you'll forgive him for being weak and selfish and leaving you alone in this world," he said, his voice matter of fact, like he was offering me options for dinner instead of my father's execution. "Choice 2. You marry me, become my wife in every legal and binding sense of the word, and your father's debt is considered paid in full. He gets to live out whatever remains of his pathetic life, and you get to ensure that his weakness doesn't result in his death, though it will result in your freedom being forfeit to me." The words didn't make sense at first, bouncing around in my head like marbles in an empty jar, because surely he couldn't have just said what I thought he said, couldn't have just proposed marriage like it was a business transaction, couldn't possibly want to marry a waitress from a rundown diner when he clearly had access to any woman he wanted. "You can't be serious," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. "You don't even know me. Why would you want to marry me? This doesn't make any sense." "I know everything I need to know about you, Isabel," he said, pulling out his phone and showing me pictures. Me at the diner, me at the grocery store, me walking home from work. Weeks and weeks of surveillance that made my skin crawl and my stomach turn because he'd been watching me, studying me, planning this for longer than I could comprehend. "I know you work 2 jobs to support your worthless father. I know you haven't been on a date in over a year because you're too busy trying to survive. I know you're loyal to a fault and strong in ways you don't even recognize. And I've decided that you would make an acceptable wife for a man in my position, a woman who understands sacrifice and duty and the cost of protecting what's yours." "This is insane," I said, backing away from the car, even though his men still surrounded me, even though there was nowhere to go and no escape from this nightmare that my father had created. "You can't just buy a wife like I'm some kind of property. You can't force me into marriage because my father made stupid choices. This isn't the Dark Ages or some kind of twisted fairy tale. This is real life, and I have rights, and—" "You have exactly the rights I allow you to have," Dante interrupted, his voice cutting through my panic like a knife through silk, sharp and final and absolutely certain. "Your father made a deal with the devil, Bella, and now you have to pay the price because that's how this works. That's how my world operates, and you can accept it or you can watch him die. But those are your only options, the only choices you get in this situation that he created and you inherited." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a black business card with a single phone number embossed in gold, holding it out to me like it was a lifeline instead of a chain that would bind me to him forever. 24 hours, Isabel," he said, his dark eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made me feel like I was burning from the inside out. "Call this number and tell me your decision. And whatever you choose, choose knowing that I always get what I want in the end, and what I want is you wearing my ring and bearing my name and belonging to me in every way that matters." The tall man closed the car door, and I stood there in the parking lot, holding that black card, like it was contaminated with something deadly. Watching the Rolls-Royce drive away into the night, followed by the 3 SUVs, leaving me alone with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. I looked down at the card in my trembling hand, at the number that represented my father's life or my freedom, but not both, never both, and I felt something inside me break in a way I knew would never fully heal. 24 hours to decide if I would become the bride of the most feared man in the city. 24 hours to choose between my father's life and my own. 24 hours before I called that number and spoke the words that would seal my fate and transform me from Isabel Romano, waitress and daughter and struggling survivor, into something else entirely, something that belonged to Dante Salvatore in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend. I walked home in a daze, my feet carrying me along familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign and dangerous, and when I opened the door to our apartment, I found my father passed out on the couch, empty bottles scattered around him like evidence of his weakness and my impending doom. I stood there watching him sleep, this man who had given me life, and then systematically destroyed it through his own selfish choices, and I felt anger and love and betrayal all mixed together into something that tasted like poison on my tongue. "Dad," I said, shaking his shoulder until he woke up with bloodshot eyes and breath that reeked of whiskey and broken promises. "Dad, we need to talk about Dante Salvatore, and the $3 million you owe him and the choice he just gave me that's going to destroy my life one way or another." He looked at me, and I saw the moment comprehension dawned, saw the fear and guilt and shame wash over his face like a wave, and then he started crying, actually crying. Tears streaming down his face as he grabbed my hands and begged for forgiveness that I didn't know if I could give. "I'm sorry, baby girl. I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could win it back. I thought one more game would fix everything. I never thought he'd come after you, never thought my debts would become your burden to bear." "He wants me to marry him," I said flatly, the words feeling surreal even as I spoke them, like I was narrating someone else's life instead of my own, rapidly unraveling existence. "He's giving me 24 hours to decide if I want to become his wife to pay off your debt, or if I want to let him kill you and walk away from all of this. And I hate you so much right now for putting me in this position, for making me choose between your life and my freedom, for being so weak and selfish that you gambled away my future along with your money." My father sobbed harder, and I wanted to comfort him, but I couldn't find it in myself to offer reassurance when my entire world was crumbling around me because of his choices. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice breaking on every word. And I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw my mother in his eyes, the woman who had loved him despite his flaws, who had believed he could be better, who had died never knowing how far he would fall. "I don't know," I whispered, even though that was a lie, because somewhere deep in my soul I already knew what I was going to do, what I had to do, because I was my mother's daughter, and she had taught me about sacrifice and love and protecting family even when they didn't deserve it. "I have until tomorrow to decide if I'm going to marry a monster to save your worthless life, and you're going to have to live with knowing that whatever happens next, whatever he does to me, whatever I become as his wife, it's all your fault, all of it, and I will never, ever forgive you for this." I left him crying on the couch and went to my room, closing the door and leaning against it as my own tears finally came, hot and bitter and filled with a grief that felt like drowning. I pulled out the black card and stared at that gold number, imagining Dante Salvatore on the other end of the line waiting for my call, waiting to claim his prize, waiting to transform me into something that belonged to him. My phone sat on my nightstand, and I picked it up with shaking hands, my finger hovering over the numbers, and I thought about my mother and my father and the life I'd built from nothing, and the future that had just been ripped away by a man with dark eyes and a scar on his jaw and absolutely no mercy in his soul. I thought about choice and freedom and what it meant to sacrifice yourself for someone else. And I thought about Dante's words. "Your father made a deal with the devil, Bella. and now you have to pay the price." I dialed the number before I could change my mind, before fear could paralyze me completely, and it rang once, twice, and then his voice filled my ear, dark and certain and somehow satisfied, like he'd known all along what I would choose. "Isabel," he said, my name a possession already. "Have you made your decision?" "Yes," I said, my voice surprisingly steady even as tears streamed down my face, and my heart shattered into pieces I knew I'd never fully recover. "I'll do it. I'll marry you. I'll be your wife and pay my father's debt and give you whatever you want. Just don't kill him, please. I'm begging you, don't take him away from me even though he doesn't deserve my protection or my sacrifice or anything except my hatred." "Good girl," Dante said, and I could hear the smile in his voice, the triumph of a predator who'd successfully trapped his prey. "The wedding is tomorrow at my private estate. My men will collect you at dawn, wear something appropriate for becoming Mrs. Salvatore because this is a one-time event, and I expect you to look the part of my bride, even if you're walking to your own funeral." The line went dead, and I sat there in my dark bedroom holding a phone that suddenly felt like the heaviest thing I'd ever carried, and I realized with absolute certainty that the girl I'd been, Isabel Romano, waitress and dreamer and fighter, had just ceased to exist, replaced by something new and terrifying and utterly unknown. Tomorrow I would marry the devil himself, and whatever came after that would either destroy me completely or transform me into something that could survive in his dark world. And right now, sitting in the ruins of my old life, I honestly didn't know which outcome terrified me more. Dawn came too quickly, creeping through my window like an unwelcome visitor bringing news of a death in the family. And I suppose in a way that's exactly what it was. The death of Isabel Romano, and the birth of whoever I would become as Dante Salvatore's wife. A transformation I wasn't ready for, but had no choice except to endure. I hadn't slept at all, spending the entire night staring at my ceiling and watching shadows shift across the cracked plaster, while my mind raced through every possible escape scenario and found each one more impossible than the last. Because where could I run that Dante wouldn't find me? And even if I did manage to disappear, what would happen to my father when Dante's patience ran out and his promise of mercy evaporated like morning mist? The apartment was silent except for my father's snoring from the living room, that familiar sound that used to bring me comfort when I was a child, afraid of thunderstorms, but now only reminded me of his weakness and the price I was paying for his inability to control his demons and face his responsibilities like a man instead of a coward. The knock on the door came at exactly 6 o'clock. 3 sharp raps that sounded like a judge's gavel sealing my fate, and I opened it to find 2 women standing in the hallway, both impeccably dressed in designer clothes that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe combined. "Miss Romano," the older one said, her voice crisp and professional with just a hint of sympathy that made me wonder if she knew what kind of marriage I was walking into, or if she just assumed all brides looked this terrified on their wedding day. "I'm Elena, Mr. Salvatore's personal assistant, and this is Marie, who will be helping you prepare for today's ceremony, and we need to leave immediately because we have a very tight schedule and Mr. Salvatore is extremely particular about punctuality and presentation." I grabbed my purse, not bothering to pack anything else because what was the point of bringing pieces of my old life into whatever fresh hell awaited me? And I followed them downstairs to another black SUV that sat purring at the curb like a panther waiting to devour me. My father appeared in the doorway as I was getting into the vehicle, his face haggard and aged 10 years overnight, and he raised his hand in a wave that might have been goodbye or apology or plea for forgiveness. But I turned away without acknowledging him, because I couldn't bear to look at the man whose choices had brought me to this moment. Couldn't stomach the sight of him standing there alive and free, while I rode toward my own gilded cage. The drive took us out of the city and into the countryside, winding through roads lined with trees that were just beginning to show their autumn colors. And under different circumstances, I might have found it beautiful. This landscape painted in golds and reds and oranges that looked like the world was on fire. We passed through a massive iron gate that swung open automatically, the Salvatore family crest emblazoned on the metal, a wolf with a crown and a sword, and I felt my stomach drop as we drove up a tree-lined driveway that seemed to go on forever, finally emerging in front of an estate that looked more like a palace than a home, all stone and glass and money that stretched toward the sky like a monument to power and privilege. "Welcome to Salvatore Manor," Elena said as we pulled up to the front entrance where more staff waited to whisk me away to whatever preparations Dante had deemed necessary for his reluctant bride. "This will be your home now, Miss Romano, and I suggest you start getting used to it, because Mr. Salvatore has very specific expectations about how his wife should conduct herself, and the sooner you learn the rules of this world, the easier your transition will be." They led me through halls that looked like they belonged in a museum, past artwork that I recognized from my art history classes in college before I'd had to drop out to support my father's gambling habit, and I felt impossibly small and out of place in this world of marble floors and crystal chandeliers, and beauty that existed only because someone had enough money to buy it. We entered a suite that was larger than my entire apartment, all cream and gold with furniture that looked like it had been imported from European palaces, and Marie immediately began pulling out garment bags and jewelry boxes, while Elena consulted her tablet like she was coordinating a military operation instead of a wedding. "The dress," Marie said, unzipping a garment bag to reveal the most beautiful gown I'd ever seen. All ivory silk and delicate lace with a fitted bodice that would hug every curve, and a skirt that flowed like water. The kind of dress every girl dreams about wearing on her wedding day, back when she still believes in fairy tales and happy endings. "Mr. Salvatore had it custom-made based on your measurements, and I must say his taste is impeccable, as always, though I suppose when you have unlimited resources, you can afford to be particular about these things." I wanted to refuse it, wanted to show up to this farce of a wedding in my diner uniform just to spite him and make it clear that I wasn't a willing participant in this charade. But I knew that petty rebellion would only make things worse, and probably wouldn't even register as an insult to a man like Dante, who was used to getting exactly what he wanted, exactly how he wanted it. They dressed me like I was a doll, stripping away my old clothes and replacing them with expensive lingerie that felt like sin against my skin, then carefully lifting the dress over my head and fastening what seemed like 1,000 tiny buttons down my spine, each one another link in the chain that bound me to my new life. Marie did my makeup with an artist's precision, transforming my face into something that looked like it belonged to someone else entirely. Someone sophisticated and composed instead of terrified and grieving. And she styled my dark hair into an elegant updo with a few carefully placed curls framing my face in a way that made me look older, more polished, more like the kind of woman who might actually belong on Dante Salvatore's arm. Elena fastened a necklace around my throat, diamonds that felt cold as ice and probably cost more than I would make in my entire lifetime, and matching earrings that caught the light and sparkled like captured stars. And when they finally turned me toward the mirror, I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. "Beautiful," Elena said with genuine appreciation, though whether she was admiring her own handiwork or actually complimenting me I couldn't tell. "Mr. Salvatore will be very pleased, and that's what matters today and every day, going forward, because pleasing him is your primary responsibility now, understanding what he wants before he has to ask for it, and making sure his home runs smoothly, and his reputation remains untarnished by any behavior that might reflect poorly on the Salvatore name." I wanted to ask what happened to wives who failed to please him. What became of women who didn't live up to his expectations or serve his needs adequately? But I was afraid of the answer, so I kept my mouth shut, and let them lead me through more hallways to a private chapel that I hadn't even known existed on the property. The chapel was small but exquisite, with stained glass windows that cast colored light across marble floors and wooden pews that gleamed with polish. And standing at the altar was a priest who looked distinctly uncomfortable, like he knew he was presiding over something that had nothing to do with love or God's blessing, and everything to do with power and possession. The pews were filled with people I didn't know, men in expensive suits with hard eyes and women dripping in jewels who watched me walk down the aisle with expressions ranging from pity to calculation to something that might have been envy. And I realized these were Dante's family and associates, the people who populated his dark world and accepted violence and corruption as normal parts of daily life. I recognized some faces from news reports about organized crime, men who'd been investigated but never convicted, women who smiled at charity galas while their husbands ordered executions, and I understood with perfect clarity that I was marrying into something far more dangerous and complex than I'd imagined. But none of them mattered. None of the curious stares or whispered comments registered at all, because standing at the altar waiting for me was Dante Salvatore, and the sight of him drove every other thought from my mind like a hurricane clearing the landscape. He wore a black suit that fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his body, which it probably had, and his dark hair was slicked back to reveal the sharp angles of his face and that scar on his jaw that somehow made him more attractive instead of less, like proof that he'd survived things that would have killed weaker men. His eyes locked onto mine the moment I appeared, and I felt the impact of that gaze like a physical touch. Dark and possessive and absolutely certain that I was already his regardless of what words the priest spoke or what vows I pretended to make. I walked down that aisle on Elena's arm since my father wasn't there to give me away, though even if he had been invited, I would have refused to let him participate in this mockery of everything a wedding should be. And each step felt like walking toward my own execution, except the executioner was beautiful and terrifying and looking at me like I was something precious he'd fought to obtain. When I reached the altar, Dante held out his hand, and I placed mine in it, feeling the warmth of his skin and the controlled strength in his fingers as they closed around mine. Not painfully, but firmly enough that I understood escape was no longer an option, had never really been an option from the moment he decided he wanted me. The priest began the ceremony, his voice droning through traditional words about love and honor and cherishing until death do us part. And I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, because there was no love here, only transaction and power, and a debt paid in human currency. Dante's family watched with varying degrees of interest, and I noticed his younger brother Marco sitting in the front row with a smile that made my skin crawl. Something predatory and cruel in his expression that suggested he enjoyed watching people trapped in situations they couldn't escape, that he found entertainment in suffering and powerlessness. Do you, Isabel Marie Romano, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? The priest asked, and I could feel everyone waiting for my answer, holding their collective breath to see if I would actually go through with it, or if I'd break and run and condemn my father to whatever fate Dante had planned for men who failed to pay their debts. I do, I whispered, the words feeling like surrender and defiance at the same time, like I was giving up everything I'd been while simultaneously claiming some measure of control over my own destruction. Dante's hand tightened around mine almost imperceptibly, and I saw something flash in his dark eyes that might have been triumph or satisfaction, or something else I didn't have a name for yet. And do you, Dante Alessandro Salvatore, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? The priest continued, and Dante didn't hesitate for even a fraction of a second before answering. I do, he said, his voice deep and certain, and carrying a weight of possession that made it clear he wasn't just agreeing to vows, but claiming ownership of something he'd already decided belonged to him. She's mine now, in every way that matters, and anyone who tries to take her from me will learn exactly why people fear the Salvatore name. The priest looked uncomfortable with this deviation from traditional responses, but quickly moved on to the exchange of rings, and Dante produced a platinum band studded with diamonds that caught the colored light from the stained glass windows and sparkled like promises that would never be kept. He slid it onto my finger with steady hands, and I felt the weight of it settle against my skin like a shackle disguised as jewelry. Beautiful and binding and completely inescapable. I placed a simpler platinum band on his finger, my hands shaking slightly, and he smiled at that visible sign of my nervousness, like it pleased him to know he affected me this way. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife, the priest said, sounding relieved that we'd made it through the ceremony without incident. You may kiss your bride. Dante stepped closer, and I tilted my face up toward his because there was no point in resisting this final seal on our unholy union, and I expected something brutal or dominating or designed to remind me of my powerlessness. Instead, he cupped my face with both hands, his thumbs brushing across my cheekbones with unexpected gentleness, and when his lips met mine, I felt something electric shoot through my entire body, a current of desire and danger that made my knees weak and my brain short-circuit. He kissed me like he was claiming me but also savoring me, like I was something valuable that deserved care even as he took possession. And when he finally pulled back, I was breathless and confused and angry at my own body for responding to him when I should have felt nothing but revulsion and fear. Mine, he whispered against my lips, quiet enough that only I could hear. You belong to me now, Isabel. Every breath you take, every thought in your head, every beat of your heart, all mine, and I protect what's mine with everything I have. The chapel erupted in polite applause, though I noticed several of the women looking at me with something like sympathy mixed with resignation, like they understood exactly what I'd just signed up for, and knew it wouldn't be the fairy tale the beautiful dress and expensive ring suggested. Dante tucked my hand into the crook of his arm and led me back down the aisle, past his family and associates, who smiled and nodded, like this was a normal wedding instead of a business transaction dressed up in religious ceremony. And I felt their eyes on me like brands marking me as Salvatore property now. We were escorted to what Elena called the reception, though it was really just an intimate family dinner in a dining room that could have seated 50 people, but held only about 20, all of them connected to Dante's empire in ways I would need to learn if I had any hope of surviving in this world. Dante kept me close, his hand on my lower back or his arm around my waist, touching me constantly like he needed to remind everyone, including me, that I was his wife now, his possession, his responsibility, and his prize. The dinner passed in a blur of expensive wine and courses I couldn't taste because my throat was tight with anxiety and my stomach churned with the reality of what I'd done, what I'd become, who I now belonged to for better or worse until death did us part. Marco made several comments that seemed designed to make me uncomfortable, suggestions about wedding nights, and Dante's appetites that made the other family members laugh while I wanted to disappear into the floor. But Dante shut him down with a single look that could have frozen fire, and I saw genuine fear flash across Marco's face before he muttered an apology and turned his attention to his wine. Finally, mercifully, the dinner ended and Dante stood, pulling me up with him and announcing to the assembled family that he was taking his bride home, the word home carrying implications that made my pulse race and my palms sweat. We said our goodbyes, or rather Dante said them while I stood silent and terrified beside him. And then we were in yet another vehicle heading toward what Elena had called the main residence, which apparently was different from the estate where we'd had the ceremony, because of course Dante Salvatore owned multiple properties because one massive mansion wasn't enough for a man of his wealth and power. The main residence turned out to be a modern fortress disguised as a luxury home, all steel and glass and security measures that made it clear this wasn't just a place to live, but a stronghold designed to keep enemies out and valuable things in. And I realized with sinking dread that I was now one of those valuable things that needed protecting and containing. Dante led me through rooms that showcased his wealth and taste, everything sleek and expensive and carefully curated to project power and refinement, until we reached a set of double doors that he opened to reveal what was clearly the master suite. The bedroom was enormous, decorated in blacks and grays and deep blues that felt masculine and sophisticated, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city lights and a bed that dominated the space like an altar to activities I wasn't ready to think about yet. Dante closed the doors behind us, and suddenly we were alone for the first time since he'd proposed this insane arrangement, and the silence felt heavy with expectation and unspoken rules I didn't know yet. "There are things you need to understand about being my wife," he said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact, as he shrugged out of his jacket and began unbuttoning his shirt. And I tried not to stare at the revealed expanse of his chest. The muscles and the scars that told stories of violence survived, and battles won. "You don't leave this property without my permission and my guards. You don't contact anyone from your old life without my knowledge and approval. You attend all family functions and social events as my partner. And you smile and play the role of the devoted wife, regardless of how you actually feel about me, or this arrangement." I stood frozen near the door, still in my wedding dress, feeling like a sacrifice brought to the temple, and trying to decide if I should fight or submit or try some third option I hadn't thought of yet. "And if I refuse?" I asked, proud that my voice came out steady, even though everything inside me was screaming. "What happens if I don't want to follow your rules or play your games or pretend to be something I'm not?" He turned to face me fully, his shirt hanging, open, and his dark eyes unreadable in the dim lighting. "Then you make things difficult for both of us, and I have to enforce consequences that neither of us will enjoy. And your father learns that his debt hasn't actually been paid in full because his daughter couldn't manage to follow simple instructions," he said, and the threat was implicit but unmistakable. My cooperation wasn't just about me anymore. It was still tied to my father's continued existence. "You're a monster," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them, before I could remember that insulting powerful men was generally a bad strategy for survival. "You manipulated everything, forced me into this marriage, and now you're holding my father's life over my head to make sure I comply with your demands, and you call that protection or partnership or whatever twisted justification you're using to make yourself feel better about essentially buying a human being." I expected anger, maybe violence, some explosive reaction that would confirm every terrible thing I'd imagined about him. But instead, Dante just smiled that dangerous smile that made my stomach flip and my pulse race for entirely wrong reasons. "I never claimed to be anything other than what I am, Bella," he said, stalking toward me with predatory grace that reminded me of a big cat approaching prey. "I'm a man who sees what he wants and takes it. A man who lives in a world where power is the only currency that matters, and weakness gets you killed. And yes, I manipulated circumstances to make you mine because I wanted you, and I don't accept being denied things I want." He stopped close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell his cologne mixed with something uniquely him, and I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact because he was tall, and I was still in the heels Marie had insisted I wear. "But here's what you need to understand, Isabel. I don't take unwilling women. I don't force myself on people who don't want me, and despite what you might think, I'm not going to drag you to that bed and claim my conjugal rights just because some priest said words over us, and I put a ring on your finger." I blinked, confused and uncertain, because this wasn't matching any of the scenarios I'd constructed in my head about how this night would go. "What are you saying?" I asked, hating how uncertain I sounded. How much I wanted him to clarify what he meant, because the not knowing was somehow worse than any definite threat would have been. "I'm saying that you'll share my bed because married couples sleep together, and I won't have my staff gossiping about separate rooms or marriage troubles, but I won't touch you sexually until you ask me to, until you beg me to, until you want it as much as I do," he said, his eyes burning into mine with an intensity that made me feel like I was being consumed from the inside out. "You're going to live in my house and wear my ring and attend my functions and follow my rules, but your body remains your own until you decide to give it to me. And when that happens, and it will happen, Bella, don't fool yourself into thinking otherwise. It will be because you chose it, not because I forced it." "I will never ask you to touch me," I said, lifting my chin in defiance even as part of me recognized the challenge in his words and wondered if he was right. if eventually I would break and want him despite everything he'd done. I'll play your wife in public and sleep in your bed and follow your rules because I don't have a choice. But I will never willingly give myself to you. Never beg for anything from you except my freedom. We'll see, he said, that same confidence and certainty radiating from him like heat from a flame. But for tonight, get changed into something comfortable. There are clothes in the closet that should fit you. And get some rest because tomorrow your real education begins, learning how to be Mrs. Salvatore and navigate a world that will eat you alive if you don't learn its rules quickly enough. He turned and walked toward what I assumed was the bathroom, leaving me standing in the middle of the bedroom in my wedding dress, feeling confused and angry and strangely disappointed that he wasn't going to push the issue tonight. I found the closet, which was actually a room larger than my bedroom at the apartment, and discovered it already filled with women's clothes in my size, everything designer and expensive and clearly purchased specifically for me. More evidence of how long he'd been planning this, and how thoroughly he'd prepared for my arrival in his life. I changed into silk pajamas that felt like sin against my skin and washed off the wedding makeup, scrubbing at my face until the sophisticated stranger in the mirror disappeared, and I could see glimpses of Isabel Romano again, though I wondered how long it would be before she disappeared completely. When I emerged from the bathroom, Dante was already in bed, shirtless and apparently comfortable with the situation in a way I couldn't imagine being, and he watched me approach like he was cataloging my reactions and filing them away for future use. I climbed into the bed, staying as far to my side as possible, and he reached over to turn off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness broken only by the city lights filtering through the windows. "Good night, wife," he said, and I could hear the amusement in his voice, like this was all some elaborate game he was playing and winning. "Sleep well, because tomorrow your real life begins, and I promise it will be nothing like anything you've experienced before." I lay there in the dark, acutely aware of his presence beside me, the warmth of his body and the sound of his breathing, and I tried to convince myself that I could do this, that I could survive being married to Dante Salvatore without losing myself completely in the process. I must have eventually fallen asleep because I woke to early morning light and the smell of coffee, and for a moment I forgot where I was and thought I was back in my apartment preparing for another shift at the diner. Then I heard my phone buzzing insistently from the nightstand, a sound that seemed wrong because I didn't remember having my phone, thought I'd left it at the apartment when Dante's people collected me. I reached for it, confused, and saw a blocked number flashing on the screen, and against every instinct that told me not to answer, I swiped to accept the call. "Isabel Romano," a voice said, distorted and mechanical like something from a horror movie. Or should I say, Isabel Salvatore now, the newest acquisition of the man who destroyed my family and took everything I loved. My blood turned to ice, and I sat up in bed, looking over to find Dante's side empty, which meant he was already up, and I was alone for this nightmare conversation. "Who is this?" I whispered, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribcage. "Your husband killed my family 5 years ago," the voice continued, each word dripping with hatred and pain and promises of violence. "He murdered my father, my brothers, my uncle, everyone I cared about, and he did it without mercy or hesitation because that's what monsters like Dante Salvatore do. They destroy everything beautiful in this world and call it business." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, even though I was starting to understand with horrible clarity that marrying into the Salvatore family meant inheriting their enemies, along with their wealth and power. "I just married him yesterday. I don't know anything about his past or his business or—" "You know enough," the voice interrupted. "You know you're married to a killer. You know you're sleeping next to a man with blood on his hands. And now you're going to know what it feels like to lose everything you love, just like he made me lose everything I loved." "Please," I whispered, fear making my voice shake. "Please, I didn't have a choice. I didn't want this. I'm just trying to survive and protect my father. I'm not your enemy." "You became my enemy the moment you put on that ring," the voice said, cold and final as a death sentence. You have 3 days to leave him, 3 days to walk away from your marriage and disappear. And if you don't, everyone you care about dies, starting with your pathetic gambling addict of a father, and then maybe you'll understand what loss really means. The line went dead, and I sat there holding the phone with trembling hands, my mind racing through the implications of what I'd just heard. The reality that I wasn't just married to a dangerous man, but had become a target for everyone who hated him and wanted revenge. I looked down at the platinum and diamond ring on my finger, this symbol of possession and protection that had just become a target painted on my back, and I realized that everything I thought I understood about my new life was just the surface of something much deeper and darker than I could have imagined. The bedroom door opened, and Dante walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee, already dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, and he took one look at my face and set the cups down with careful precision that suggested he was controlling his reaction to something he found concerning. "What happened?" he asked, his voice calm, but his eyes sharp and assessing, and I knew he could read the fear on my face like words written in my native language. "Someone called me," I said, holding up the phone like evidence at a trial. "They said you killed their family 5 years ago, and they're going to kill everyone I love if I don't leave you within 3 days, and I don't understand what's happening, or why someone would target me when I just became part of your life yesterday." Dante's expression went absolutely cold, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw what he looked like when he was truly dangerous. Not the controlled menace he'd shown me before, but something raw and lethal that made every primitive part of my brain scream at me to run. "Give me the phone," he said, holding out his hand, and when I placed it in his palm, I noticed that his knuckles had gone white with the force of his grip, the only visible sign of whatever fury was building inside him. He looked at the phone, made a call to someone I couldn't hear, and spoke in rapid Italian that sounded like orders being given to soldiers preparing for war. When he finished, he turned back to me with an expression that was somehow both reassuring and terrifying, like he was promising protection and vengeance in the same breath. "You're not leaving me," he said, each word precise and final as bullets. "And anyone who threatens what's mine is going to learn exactly why people fear the Salvatore name, why my enemies don't live long enough to enjoy their revenge, and why making an enemy of me is the last mistake they'll ever make." He pulled me to my feet and into his arms, and I should have resisted. But instead I found myself clinging to him, like he was safety instead of danger. Like his promises of violence were somehow comforting instead of terrifying. "They threatened my father," I said against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath my cheek. "They're going to kill him because I married you, because I'm wearing your ring, because I belong to you now." "No one touches your father," Dante said, his hand stroking through my hair with unexpected gentleness even as his voice promised death to anyone who tried. "No one touches anything or anyone that belongs to me, and they're going to learn that lesson in the most permanent way possible. And you're going to learn what it really means to be under my protection, to have the full weight of the Salvatore family standing between you and anyone foolish enough to threaten you." I pulled back enough to look up at his face, seeing the truth in his dark eyes, the absolute certainty that he would burn the world down to protect what he considered his. And I realized with something like wonder and horror that I believed him, that despite everything he'd done and the way he'd manipulated me into this marriage, I actually trusted that he would keep me safe from whoever had just threatened to destroy my life. "What do we do now?" I asked, and the "we" slipped out without me meaning it to. Like somewhere in the past 24 hours, I'd started thinking of us as a unit instead of captor and captive, monster and victim, buyer and bought. "Now," Dante said, his thumb brushing across my lower lip in a gesture that sent electricity through my entire body. "You get dressed in something appropriate for meeting the rest of my family, because they're gathering here this morning for a formal introduction to my new wife, and you're going to show them that you're strong enough to survive in our world, that you're worthy of the Salvatore name, and that anyone who tries to use you against me is making a fatal mistake." He released me and headed toward the door, then paused and looked back with an expression I couldn't quite read. "And Isabel? Welcome to your new life, where every day is a battle and trust is currency, and the only thing standing between you and a world full of people who want to hurt you is me, and the promises I made when I put that ring on your finger. And I always, always keep my promises, especially the ones that involve protecting what's mine." The door closed behind him, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and the terrifying realization that in trying to save my father, I'd walked into something infinitely more dangerous than a loveless marriage. That being Mrs. Dante Salvatore meant living with a target on my back and depending on a monster to keep me alive. And the most shocking part was discovering that some twisted, broken part of me was starting to want exactly that. I stood in front of the massive closet that Dante had filled with clothes chosen specifically for me, running my hands over fabrics that cost more than I used to make in months. And I tried to decide what exactly one wears to meet a family of criminals who probably saw me as nothing more than their boss's latest acquisition, a debt payment dressed up in designer labels and expensive perfume. My hands were still shaking from the phone call, from the distorted voice promising death and destruction if I didn't abandon the marriage I'd barely had time to process. And I kept thinking about my father alone in our apartment, with no idea that someone wanted him dead because of choices I'd made to save his worthless life. Elena had told me yesterday that appearance mattered in this world, that people would judge me based on how I presented myself, and whether I looked like I belonged at Dante's side or like some charity case he'd taken pity on. So I selected a deep emerald dress that hugged my curves without being overtly sexual, paired it with heels that made me 3 inches taller and significantly less stable, and tried to make myself look like someone who deserved to wear the Salvatore name, even though I felt like an imposter playing dress-up in someone else's life. I did my own makeup this time, keeping it simpler than Marie's expert application from yesterday, but still polished enough to suggest I had some idea what I was doing. And I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to find some trace of the girl who used to serve coffee, and dream about saving enough money to finish college and maybe travel somewhere exotic. That girl was gone, replaced by this stranger with haunted eyes and a platinum wedding band that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. And I wondered if I would ever recognize myself again, or if Dante Salvatore would consume every piece of who I used to be until nothing remained except the woman he wanted me to become. I heard voices downstairs, multiple voices speaking in Italian and English, and the kind of coded language that people use when they are discussing business they don't want outsiders to understand. And I realized with a jolt of anxiety that Dante's family was already here, and I was hiding in the bedroom like a coward instead of facing whatever judgment and scrutiny they'd brought with them. Taking a deep breath that did absolutely nothing to calm my racing heart, I left the safety of the master suite and made my way down the sweeping staircase that probably cost more than most people's houses, my heels clicking against marble floors and announcing my approach like a countdown to my own execution. The voices grew louder as I descended, and I could pick out Dante's deep rumble among the others. That voice that had promised to protect me and destroy anyone who threatened what was his. And I clung to that promise like a lifeline, even though I knew better than to trust monsters who spoke pretty words while committing ugly deeds. I reached the bottom of the stairs and followed the sound to what appeared to be a formal living room decorated in the same sleek, expensive style as the rest of the house. And when I stepped through the doorway, every conversation stopped, and every eye turned to assess the newest member of the Salvatore family. Dante stood near the fireplace holding what looked like expensive scotch, even though it was barely 9 in the morning. And when he saw me, his expression shifted into something possessive and almost proud, like I'd managed to meet some standard he'd set without telling me what it was. "Isabel," he said, holding out his hand in an unmistakable command for me to come stand beside him, and I crossed the room on shaking legs while trying to project confidence I absolutely didn't feel, trying to remember that these people could smell weakness like sharks smell blood in the water. His arm came around my waist the moment I was within reach, pulling me against his side in a gesture that was both protective and proprietary. and I felt the warmth of his body through the expensive fabric of his suit, and remembered with unwelcome clarity what it had felt like to sleep beside him last night, to wake up in his arms even though I'd started on the opposite side of the bed. "Everyone, this is my wife, Isabel Salvatore," he announced, and hearing my new name spoken out loud by his voice made something twist in my chest that I didn't want to examine too closely. "Isabel, this is my family. My uncle Roberto and his wife Francesca, my cousin Antonio and his sister Bianca, my aunt Lucia, and you've already met my brother Marco, though not under the best circumstances." I recognized Marco from the wedding. That cruel smile and predatory eyes that made my skin crawl, and he raised his glass to me in a mock toast that felt more like a threat than a welcome. "Welcome to the family, sister," he said, the word sister coming out wrong, like he was tasting it and finding it amusing rather than accepting it as fact. "I hope you're prepared for what being a Salvatore wife entails, because it's not all designer clothes and diamond necklaces. There are expectations and responsibilities and consequences for failing to meet them." "Marco," Dante said, just his name, but the tone carried enough warning that Marco's smile faltered, and he took a step back. And I realized I was watching the family hierarchy play out in real time, seeing how even Dante's own brother feared him enough to back down from a single word. "Isabel is under my protection, which means she's under all of your protection, and anyone who forgets that will answer to me personally, and I promise you don't want to find out what that means." Roberto, who looked like an older, softer version of Dante, stepped forward with a warm smile that seemed more genuine than Marco's mockery. "Ignore Marco. He's always been a jealous little shit who can't stand when Dante gets something he wants," he said, taking my hand and kissing it in an old-fashioned gesture that might have been charming under different circumstances. "Welcome to the family, Isabel, and congratulations on your marriage. Though I suspect congratulations might not be quite the right sentiment given the circumstances that brought you here." I appreciated his honesty more than I probably should have. Appreciated that at least one person was willing to acknowledge that this wasn't a normal marriage born of love and courtship, but something darker and more transactional. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. And I noticed the women in the room watching me with various expressions ranging from sympathy to calculation to something that might have been recognition, like they understood exactly what it felt like to be bound to dangerous men, whether they wanted it or not. Francesca approached next, elegant and poised in a way that suggested decades of practice navigating this world, and she took both my hands, in hers with surprising warmth. "The first months are always the hardest, learning the rules and figuring out how to survive in a world that doesn't forgive mistakes," she said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that only I could hear. "But you're stronger than you think. I can see it in your eyes. And if you need someone to talk to about what it means to be married to a Salvatore man, my door is always open." Before I could respond, before I could process this unexpected offer of friendship or alliance or whatever it was, the windows exploded inward in a shower of glass, and the deafening sound of gunfire erupted from multiple directions. And suddenly, the elegant living room transformed into a war zone, with bullets tearing through furniture and walls, and the peaceful morning shattering into violence and chaos. Dante moved faster than I thought humanly possible, pulling me down to the floor and covering my body with his own, while simultaneously drawing a gun from somewhere I hadn't realized he was carrying. And I felt the impact of a bullet hitting him. Felt his body jerk against mine and knew with horrible certainty that he'd just taken a shot meant for me. "Stay down," he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos and the screaming, and the sound of return fire from his family members, who had apparently all been armed despite the casual family gathering atmosphere. "Don't move, don't lift your head, don't do anything except breathe and trust that I've got you covered." I pressed myself against the floor, feeling expensive marble cold against my cheek, and tasting fear like copper on my tongue, and I could hear men shouting in Italian and English, could smell gunpowder and blood and the acrid scent of violence unleashed. Dante fired over my head with mechanical precision, each shot deliberate and controlled, and I heard bodies hitting the floor outside and realized he was killing people, that the man whose ring I wore was actively ending lives to protect his family and his property, which now included me whether I wanted that protection or not. The gunfire seemed to last forever, but was probably only a few minutes, and then silence fell like a physical weight, broken only by heavy breathing and someone crying and the sound of glass crunching under expensive shoes as Dante's men moved through the house checking for additional threats. "Clear!" someone shouted, and then other voices echoing the same, and Dante finally moved off me, though he kept himself between my body and the destroyed windows like he expected another attack at any moment. I could see blood on his shoulder, dark and wet against the white of his shirt, and I realized the bullet that had hit him was still lodged somewhere in his body, that he'd taken a wound protecting me and hadn't even flinched or shown pain or done anything except continue fighting until the threat was eliminated. "You're bleeding," I said stupidly, my voice coming out thin and shaky, and I reached for his shoulder without thinking, my hands hovering over the wound like I could somehow fix it through will alone. "You need a hospital. You need a doctor. I need you to listen to me very carefully," Dante interrupted, his hand cupping my face and forcing me to meet his eyes, which were burning with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "This is what your life looks like now. This is what being married to me means. People will try to kill you to get to me. They'll attack my family and my home and everything I care about because that's how this world works. And you need to understand right now that this won't be the last time someone tries to hurt you." I wanted to argue, wanted to point out that I hadn't signed up for literal warfare in the living room, that protecting my father from his debts wasn't supposed to include dodging bullets and watching my husband kill people before breakfast. But the words died in my throat because he was right. Because I had signed up for this the moment I agreed to marry him. And my ignorance about what that actually meant didn't change the reality of the situation. "I understand," I whispered, though I wasn't sure I understood anything except that my life had become something from a violent movie where the heroine either died or became someone unrecognizable. "Do you?" Dante asked, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone in a gesture that seemed too tender for someone who'd just orchestrated a small massacre. "Because you didn't scream, you didn't panic, you stayed exactly where I put you and you trusted me to keep you safe, and that tells me you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. That maybe you actually can survive in my world if you're willing to learn its rules and accept its realities." Roberto appeared beside us, his own gun still drawn, and his face splattered with what I really hoped wasn't blood. "We got 6 of them, all dead, no identification, but they had Russian tattoos and equipment that suggests serious funding behind this attack," he reported, speaking to Dante like I wasn't there or like this was normal business that wives were expected to overhear. "This wasn't random. Someone planned this specifically to hit us during a family gathering, someone who knew you'd all be here this morning." "The phone call," I said, the pieces clicking together in my head with horrible clarity. "Someone called me this morning, threatened my father if I didn't leave Dante within 3 days, and they said he'd killed their family 5 years ago, and this must be connected. They must have attacked now to prove they're serious about their threats." Dante's expression went absolutely cold, and I saw the moment he shifted from protective husband to ruthless killer. Saw the transformation happen behind his eyes like watching a predator wake up from sleep. "Get the doctor here for my shoulder, put every available man on protecting Isabel's father and watching his apartment, and find out who the fuck these Russians were and who sent them before I lose my patience and start burning down every Russian operation in this city until someone gives me answers," he ordered, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made grown men jump to obey without question. "Dante, you need medical attention now," Francesca insisted, appearing from wherever she'd taken cover during the attack, looking remarkably composed for someone who'd just survived a shootout. "That bullet needs to come out, and the wound needs to be cleaned and stitched, and you standing here bleeding all over your wife isn't going to help anyone." "I'm fine," Dante said, which was obviously a lie given the amount of blood soaking through his shirt. But before anyone could argue with him, a man in a suit carrying a medical bag rushed into the destroyed living room and immediately moved toward Dante with the kind of familiarity that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd treated gunshot wounds in this house. "Marcus, good. Take care of this quickly because I have calls to make and people to kill and a very limited amount of patience for being wounded in my own home." Marcus, who I assumed was the family doctor or whatever, passed for medical care in the criminal underworld, nodded and started cutting away Dante's shirt to access the wound. And I found myself unable to look away from the process even though part of me wanted to run from the room and pretend none of this was happening. The bullet had entered his shoulder from behind, which meant he'd literally turned his back to incoming fire to shield me with his body, had consciously chosen to take a bullet rather than let it hit me. And that realization made something shift in my chest that I absolutely didn't want to acknowledge or examine. "This is going to hurt," Marcus warned, pulling out what looked like forceps, and Dante just laughed, actually laughed, like the idea of pain was amusing rather than concerning. "Everything hurts, Doc. That's just life in this business," Dante said, then turned his attention back to me while Marcus began the process of extracting the bullet from his shoulder. "Isabel, I need you to go upstairs with Francesca and Bianca. Let them help you clean up and change clothes, and try not to think too hard about what just happened, because dwelling on violence only makes it harder to function when the next attack comes." "The next attack?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly because I wasn't sure I could handle another situation like what had just happened. Wasn't sure my sanity would survive multiple attempts on my life before I'd even been married for 48 hours. "You're saying this is going to happen again? That people are going to keep trying to kill me because I'm wearing your ring?" "Yes," Dante said bluntly, not bothering to sugarcoat the reality or make me feel better about my new circumstances. "As long as you're my wife, you're a target for everyone who hates me or wants to hurt me or thinks they can use you to gain leverage against the Salvatore family, and that's not going to change no matter how much you might wish otherwise. So you have two choices. You can fall apart and become a victim who lives in constant fear, or you can learn to be strong and aware and capable of protecting yourself when I'm not around to do it for you." Francesca took my arm gently, guiding me toward the door, while Dante watched with those intense dark eyes that seemed to see everything I was trying to hide. "Come on, dear. Let's get you out of here while the men clean up this mess and make their plans for revenge, and whatever other testosterone-fueled nonsense they think will solve this problem," she said, her tone light, but her grip on my arm firm enough to communicate that this wasn't optional. "You've had quite the introduction to Salvatore family life, and I think you could use some time to process everything that just happened." I let her lead me from the room, followed by Bianca, who hadn't spoken yet, but watched me with curious eyes like I was some kind of exotic animal she wanted to study. We passed dead bodies in the hallway, men I didn't recognize lying in pools of blood, and I had to swallow hard against the nausea that rose in my throat because I'd never seen death before. Never been this close to the reality of violence and mortality, and the absolute fragility of human life. Francesca seemed completely unfazed by the carnage, stepping over bodies like they were nothing more than obstacles in her path. And I realized this was normal for her, that she'd probably witnessed dozens or hundreds of attacks over her years in this family, and had learned to compartmentalize the horror in order to survive. We reached the master suite, and Francesca closed the door firmly behind us, then turned to face me with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and assessment. "All right, let's see how you're really doing, because that brave face you're wearing downstairs is impressive, but nobody survives their first attack without having some kind of reaction, so go ahead and fall apart now while it's just us women, and there's no one to judge you for being human." I wanted to maintain my composure, wanted to prove that I was strong enough to handle whatever this life threw at me. But her permission to break down shattered whatever fragile control I'd been maintaining, and suddenly I was sobbing. Great heaving gasps that made my whole body shake and tears that felt like they'd never stop falling. Francesca pulled me into her arms like I was a child instead of a grown woman, and she stroked my hair and made soothing sounds while I cried out the terror and confusion and overwhelming sense that I'd made a terrible mistake marrying into this world of violence and death. "That's it. Let it out," Cry as much as you need to because bottling it up only makes it worse, she murmured, and I could hear decades of experience in her voice, the wisdom of a woman who'd learned these lessons the hard way. The first attack is always the worst because you don't know it's coming and you haven't built up any defenses yet. But I promise you it gets easier. You learn to live with the constant threat, and you develop instincts that help you survive, and eventually you become someone who can face down gunfire without completely losing your mind. I don't want to become that person, I said between sobs, my voice muffled against her shoulder. I don't want to be someone who's okay with violence and death and living every day wondering if someone's going to try to kill me. I just wanted to save my father and maybe eventually find a way out of this nightmare, and now I'm trapped in a world where morning coffee comes with a side of attempted murder. Bianca, who had been silent until now, laughed, actually laughed, and when I pulled back to stare at her in shock, she just shrugged with a smile that suggested she found my naivety charming rather than pathetic. Oh, honey, nobody wants to become that person. But we do it anyway, because the alternative is dying or going crazy or letting the fear control us until we're nothing but empty shells waiting for the next disaster, she said, her voice carrying a matter-of-fact tone that suggested she was speaking from personal experience. I've been shot at 17 times, stabbed twice, kidnapped once, and nearly blown up more times than I can count. And I'm still here because I learned to adapt and survive and be just as dangerous as the men who think we're weak, simply because we're women. 17 times? I repeated weakly, trying to process that number and failing completely because 17 separate occasions of people trying to kill you seemed impossible to survive, let alone survive with your sanity intact. How are you still alive? How do you function? How do you get out of bed every morning, knowing that could be the day someone finally succeeds? Because I have people who protect me, and I've learned to protect myself. And because I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to let my husband's enemies dictate how I lived my life, or make me a prisoner in my own home, Bianca said, crossing to the closet and pulling out fresh clothes for me since my dress was now covered in dust and probably blood from the floor. You're married to Dante Salvatore, which means you're married to one of the most powerful and dangerous men in this city, and that comes with perks, money, influence, protection from the best security money can buy. But it also comes with risks, and you need to decide right now if you're going to let those risks destroy you, or if you're going to learn how to navigate them. I took the clothes from her with shaking hands and moved toward the bathroom to change, my mind spinning with everything they were telling me, and everything I'd witnessed in the past hour. When I emerged wearing clean jeans and a soft sweater that felt more like armor than clothing, Francesca had made tea and was sitting on the edge of the massive bed, looking like she had all the time in the world to wait for me to process my new reality. Dante took a bullet for you, she said, without preamble, her eyes sharp and knowing as they studied my face. He could have pulled you down and shielded himself, could have pushed you out of the line of fire and taken cover separately, but instead he covered your body with his own and let himself get shot to keep you safe. And that tells me something important about how he feels about you, regardless of how this marriage started or what circumstances brought you together. He just doesn't want to lose his investment, I said, the words bitter on my tongue, even though part of me knew they weren't entirely true, that what I'd seen in Dante's eyes when he was covering me wasn't about protecting property, but something deeper and more complicated. I'm a debt payment, a transaction, not someone he actually cares about beyond what I represent in terms of settling my father's gambling debts. Francesca shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips like she knew secrets I hadn't discovered yet. I've known Dante since he was 17 years old and took over this family after his uncle murdered his father and little sister, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Never seen him take a bullet for anyone except immediate family members whose deaths would actually impact the organization, she said, setting down her teacup with deliberate precision. Whatever he told you about why he arranged this marriage, whatever story he's using to justify forcing you into this life, the truth is more complicated than simple debt collection, and the sooner you accept that, the the sooner you can start understanding the man you've married instead of the monster you think he is. Before I could respond, before I could argue that she was wrong and Dante was exactly the monster I thought he was, my phone rang again, and I felt my blood turn to ice because I knew without looking that it would be the same blocked number, the same distorted voice promising death and destruction. I answered it on speaker this time, letting Francesca and Bianca hear what I was dealing with, and the mechanical voice filled the room like poison seeping through the air. That was just a warning, Mrs. Salvatore. A small demonstration of what's coming if you don't do exactly what I tell you, the voice said, and I could hear satisfaction underneath the distortion, pleasure at having caused chaos and fear. Your husband killed 17 members of my family 5 years ago when he consolidated his power and eliminated rivals. And now I'm going to kill 17 people he cares about, starting with you and your father, and working my way through everyone whose death will cause him the maximum amount of pain. Who are you? I demanded, surprised by the strength in my voice when inside I was falling apart. What do you want from me? What would make you stop this insane revenge plot? I want him to suffer the way I've suffered. I want him to know what it feels like to lose everything. And I want you to be the instrument of his destruction, the voice said, each word precise and calculated to cause maximum damage. You have 2 days left to leave him, and if you're still wearing his ring when the deadline passes, your father dies first, slowly and painfully, and you get to live knowing you could have saved him, but chose a monster over your own family. The line went dead again, and I stood there holding the phone while Francesca and Bianca exchanged looks that suggested they were communicating without words. We need to tell Dante about this immediately, Francesca said, standing and moving toward the door with purpose. This isn't just random violence or opportunistic revenge. This is someone with resources and planning and detailed knowledge of Dante's past, and that makes them exponentially more dangerous than typical enemies. We went back downstairs to find the living room had been cleaned with remarkable efficiency, the bodies removed, and the glass swept up, and everything looking almost normal, except for the bullet holes in the walls and the lingering smell of gunpowder. Dante sat in a chair with his shoulder freshly bandaged, talking on the phone in rapid Italian that sounded like he was giving orders to mobilize an army. And when he saw me, his expression shifted from cold calculation to something warmer, something that looked almost like relief. He ended his call and stood, moving toward me with the kind of focus that made everything else fade into background noise. Tell me, he said simply, and somehow he knew there was more to tell, knew that something had happened while I was upstairs beyond just processing the attack. I told him about the second call, about the threat against my father, and the demand that I leave within 2 days, and the promise of 17 deaths to match the 17 his enemy had lost 5 years ago. He listened without interrupting, his face growing progressively darker as I spoke, and when I finished, he pulled out his own phone and made another call that lasted approximately 10 seconds. Your father is being moved to a secure location as we speak, and he'll stay there under armed guard until this threat is eliminated, he said, turning back to me with eyes that promised violence to anyone who tried to hurt what was his. No one is going to touch him. No one is going to use him against me or you, and the people making these threats are going to learn a very painful lesson about what happens when you declare war on the Salvatore family. They said 17 people, I whispered, the number feeling significant in ways I didn't fully understand. They said you killed 17 members of their family 5 years ago. Is that true? Did you really murder that many people? Dante didn't flinch from the question, or try to deny it, or soften the reality of what he'd done. Yes, I killed 17 members of the Volkov family when they tried to take over my territory and started dealing drugs to children in neighborhoods I protect. And I would do it again tomorrow, if faced with the same choice, because that's what leadership in this world requires, the willingness to eliminate threats before they destroy everything you've built and everyone you're responsible for protecting. You're a monster, I said, but the words came out softer than I intended. Less like an accusation and more like an observation, a simple statement of fact that we both already knew. You kill people. You take lives without hesitation. You've built an empire on violence and fear and blood. And I'm married to you. I'm tied to you forever because I was stupid enough to think I could save my father without destroying myself in the process. Yes, I'm a monster, Dante agreed, stepping closer and cupping my face in his hands with a gentleness that contradicted everything he'd just admitted. But I'm your monster now, and that means I will destroy anyone who tries to hurt you. I will burn down the entire world if that's what it takes to keep you safe, and you can hate me for what I am and what I've done, but you will never doubt that I protect what's mine with absolutely everything I have. He kissed me then, hard and possessive and claiming, and I should have pushed him away, but instead I found myself kissing him back with equal intensity, channeling all my fear and anger and confusion into the press of my lips against his. When he finally pulled back, we were both breathing hard, and I could see something dark and hungry in his eyes that made my stomach flip and heat pool low in my belly, despite everything that had happened, and everything I knew about who he was. Get some rest, he said, his voice rough with desire barely controlled. I have work to do, people to find and questions to ask and problems to solve, and when I come back tonight we're going to have a very serious conversation about what it means to be my wife and how we're going to handle this threat together, instead of you trying to face it alone. He left before I could respond, sweeping out of the room with Roberto and several armed men following in his wake, and I stood there with my lips still tingling from his kiss, and my mind reeling from everything that had happened in the span of a single morning. Francesca appeared at my elbow again, her presence somehow comforting despite the chaos surrounding us. You're falling for him, she observed, and it wasn't a question but a statement delivered with absolute certainty. I can see it in your eyes, the way you kissed him back, the way you're starting to believe his promises about protection, even though you know he's dangerous and violent and everything you should run from. I'm not falling for him, I protested weakly, but even I could hear the lie in my voice. I'm just trying to survive, trying to make the best of an impossible situation, trying to protect my father and myself and figure out how to live in a world where people shoot at me before breakfast. Keep telling yourself that, Francesca said with a knowing smile. But I've seen this story play out before with other Salvatore brides, the way they start out hating their husbands and end up unable to imagine life without them. And I'm willing to bet that within a month you'll be just as possessive of Dante as he is of you, just as willing to fight for this marriage despite how it started. I wanted to argue, wanted to insist she was wrong and I would never develop feelings for the man who'd manipulated my life and forced me into marriage. But before I could form the words, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. And when I opened it, my heart stopped completely, because attached was a photo of my father, tied to a chair with a gun pressed to his head, and a message that read, "Time's up, Mrs. Salvatore. Choose wisely." The photograph burned itself into my brain like acid, my father's terrified eyes staring out from my phone screen, while a gloved hand pressed a gun against his temple, and I felt something inside me break and reform into something harder, something colder, something that understood with crystal clarity that whoever had sent this message had just made the worst mistake of their pathetic life, because they'd underestimated what I would do to protect what was mine. I didn't scream or cry or fall apart the way I might have just days ago, when I was still Isabel Romano, the waitress who believed the world operated on rules and fairness and consequences that made sense. Because that girl had died somewhere between the wedding chapel and the living room shootout, replaced by someone who understood that in Dante's world, in my world now, the only currency that mattered was power and the willingness to use it without hesitation or mercy. Francesca saw my face change, saw whatever transformation was happening behind my eyes, and she pulled out her own phone with the kind of efficiency that suggested she'd handled crisis situations 1,000 times before, already calling Dante before I could even form words to explain what I was seeing. "Dante, they have her father. They sent a photo with a gun to his head, and you need to get back here right now, because I think your wife is about to do something spectacularly stupid and brave in equal measure," Francesca said into the phone, her eyes never leaving my face while she spoke. and I could hear Dante's response even from across the room. A roar of rage that promised violence on a scale I couldn't even imagine. Yes, I'm looking at her right now, and she has that expression that says she's stopped being afraid and started being angry, which in my experience with Salvatore women means she's about 5 seconds away from grabbing a gun and going after the bastards herself. She was right, I realized with something like surprise, because fear had burned away and left behind a white-hot fury that demanded action, rather than cowering in a mansion waiting for Dante to solve my problems, like I was some helpless damsel who needed a monster to rescue her. "Where is Dante keeping his weapons?" I asked, my voice coming out calm and controlled in a way that felt foreign to my own ears, and Francesca actually smiled like I'd just passed some kind of test she'd been administering since the moment we met. "I need a gun and information about how to use it, because whoever took my father is going to learn that marrying into the Salvatore family didn't make me weak. It made me dangerous in ways they never anticipated." "The weapons are in Dante's office behind the bookshelf, second shelf from the top. Red leather book is actually the release mechanism," Bianca said, appearing from wherever she'd been lurking and looking at me with something like approval in her dark eyes. "But you should know that Dante is going to lose his mind when he gets back here and finds out you're planning to go after these people, because Protective doesn't even begin to describe how he feels about you, and the idea of you putting yourself in danger is going to make him absolutely feral. I don't care what Dante thinks or feels about this situation, because that's my father with a gun to his head, and I'm the reason he's in danger. I'm the one who married a monster and painted a target on everyone I love, so I'm the one who's going to fix this before anyone else dies because of choices I made," I said, already moving toward the door, with purpose that felt like the first real decision I'd made since this nightmare began. I found Dante's office easily enough, all dark wood and leather furniture, and the kind of masculine decor that screamed power and control. And I located the red book that Bianca had mentioned, pulling it to reveal a hidden panel that swung open to display an arsenal that would have made a small army jealous. Guns of every size and description lined the shelves along with knives and what looked like enough ammunition to wage a war. And I stared at the collection, trying to figure out which weapon would be easiest for someone with absolutely no experience beyond what I'd seen in movies and television shows. Start with something small. A 9mm is standard and won't have as much kickback as the larger calibers, and for God's sake make sure the safety is on until you're actually ready to shoot someone," Francesca instructed, coming up behind me and reaching past to select a sleek black handgun that felt surprisingly heavy when she placed it in my hands. "Point at what you want to destroy, squeeze the trigger, don't pull it, and try not to close your eyes when you fire because that's how you miss your target and shoot something you didn't intend to hit, like innocent bystanders or your own foot." The front door slammed open with enough force to rattle the windows, and I heard Dante's voice, bellowing my name with a combination of fury and fear that made something in my chest tighten despite my anger at the situation we were in. He appeared in the office doorway looking like vengeance personified, his shoulder still bandaged from the earlier bullet wound, but his eyes burning with an intensity that suggested pain was the absolute last thing on his mind right now. And when he saw me holding the gun, his expression shifted into something I couldn't quite read. Something between pride and terror and possessive rage. "Put the gun down, Isabel, because you're not going anywhere near the people who took your father. You're not putting yourself in danger when I have an entire organization designed specifically to handle situations like this," he said, his voice carrying that command that probably worked on everyone in his world, but only made my spine stiffen with stubborn determination. "I've already got my best people tracking the location where that photo was taken, and within the hour we'll know exactly where they're holding him and how many men we need to eliminate to get him back safely." An hour might be too long. An hour might be exactly how much time they need to put a bullet in his brain and send me another photo of his corpse. And I'm not going to sit here drinking tea and waiting for updates while my father dies because I was too weak or too scared to do something about it. I shot back, keeping the gun pointed safely at the floor, but not setting it down despite his order. "You said I needed to be strong. You said I needed to learn how to survive in your world. Well, this is me being strong and surviving and taking control of my own fate instead of hiding behind you like I'm property that needs protecting." Dante crossed the room faster than I could track, and suddenly he was right in front of me with his hand covering mine on the gun, his body radiating heat and fury, and something else that felt like desperation underneath all that controlled violence. "You are not property. You are my wife, which means you are precious and irreplaceable and worth more to me than every dollar I've ever made or every territory I've ever controlled," he said, his voice dropping to something raw and honest that made my breath catch in my throat. "And I will not let you walk into a situation where you could be hurt or killed or taken from me, because losing you would destroy me in ways that losing money or power or reputation never could." "Why?" I demanded, needing to understand what was happening between us, needing to know if this was real or just another manipulation designed to keep me compliant and controlled. "Why do you care so much about keeping me safe when I'm just a debt payment, just a woman you forced into marriage to settle my father's gambling problems, just another possession in your collection of expensive things?" "Because I saw you 6 months ago at that diner, serving coffee to drunks and smiling at people who treated you like you were invisible, and something in your eyes called to something in me that I didn't even know existed anymore," Dante said, and his free hand came up to cup my face with a gentleness that contradicted every violent thing I knew about him. "Because I've spent my entire adult life building walls around myself and learning not to feel or care or want anything except power and control. And then you walked into my world with your stubborn pride and your fierce loyalty and your absolute refusal to break no matter what I threw at you. And suddenly those walls didn't seem nearly as important as figuring out how to make you mine in every possible way. So you manipulated everything, created a situation where I had no choice except to marry you, forced me into your life because you wanted me and didn't care what I wanted," I said. But the accusation came out softer than intended, because his honesty was disarming in ways his threats and commands never could be. "You're still a monster, Dante, even if you're a monster who apparently has feelings buried somewhere underneath all that designer suits and casual violence. Yes, I'm a monster, but I'm your monster, and right now your monster is telling you that we're going to save your father together, you and me and every resource I can mobilize, but you're not going in alone with a gun you don't know how to use properly," he said, taking the weapon from my hands and setting it aside before pulling me against his chest with arms that felt like safety and possession combined. "Trust me, Isabel. Trust that I will move heaven and earth to get him back unharmed. Trust that anyone who threatens what's mine will regret being born. And trust that you mean more to me than I know how to express with words, so I'm going to show you through actions instead." I wanted to argue, wanted to maintain my independence and my anger and my determination to handle this myself. But something in his voice and his touch and the absolute certainty radiating from him made me believe that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to face everything alone anymore. That being married to a monster meant having that monster's full resources and protection and terrifying competence on my side. "What's the plan?" I asked, and I felt him relax slightly against me like my willingness to trust him was a gift he hadn't been sure I would give. "How do we get my father back and eliminate the threat and make sure this never happens again?" "Now you're asking the right questions," Dante said with something that might have been pride in his voice, and he released me just enough to pull out his phone and show me a screen filled with information I didn't fully understand. "We've traced the photo's metadata to a warehouse in the industrial district, and I've got teams surrounding it as we speak, to prevent anyone from leaving or reinforcing. And in approximately 30 minutes, we're going to walk in there together, and you're going to see exactly what it means when someone threatens the Salvatore family." "Together?" I repeated, surprised that he was actually agreeing to let me participate instead of locking me in the bedroom for my own protection. "You're going to let me come with you to rescue my father?" "I'm going to let you stand beside me while I destroy the people who thought they could use him against us. Yes, because you're right that you need to be strong and you need to learn how this world operates, but you're going to stay exactly where I tell you to stay, and you're not going to do anything heroic or stupid that might get you killed," Dante said, and then he kissed me again, hard and possessive, and full of promises about what would happen later when this was over and we were alone. "And when this is finished, when your father is safe and our enemies are eliminated, and you've seen the full extent of what I'm capable of when someone threatens what's mine, We're going to have a very long conversation about what this marriage actually means, and whether you're ready to stop fighting what's growing between us, and accept that maybe, just maybe, the monster you married might actually be falling in love with you." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my heart race because love wasn't supposed to be part of this equation, wasn't supposed to exist between a forced bride and the man who'd manipulated her into marriage. But looking into his dark eyes, I could see the truth of what he was saying. Could see something vulnerable and almost afraid underneath all that controlled violence. Before I could respond, before I could process what he'd just admitted, his phone rang with the update he'd been waiting for, and his expression shifted back into the cold calculation of a man preparing for war. And I understood that I was about to see Dante Salvatore at his most dangerous, most lethal, most unforgiving. And whatever happened next would either destroy me completely or transform me into someone who could truly survive as his wife in this dark world where love and violence were interchangeable currencies, and trust was the most dangerous gamble of all.